I feel like I always put off filming these because I feel like I haven't done enough for a full podcast episode, and then by the time I actually get around to it, we have so much to catch up on. So grab a drink, grab a snack, and let's get started with what I'm wearing. So this is the Eun Sweater Light, which is a pattern by November Knits, and I knit this in Sandnes Garn Sunday in the color matcha, and Knitting for Olive soft silk mohair in the color pea shoots. Now, the Sandnes Garn Sunday was frogged from another project. If you've been around a while, in my Everything I Knit in 2025 video, I showed a olives vest, which was really nice. It's actually a pattern that I really, really enjoyed, but I just never wore that vest. This isn't like the color that I'm the most comfortable with in the world. It's really nice, but you know, the color I'm most comfortable with is like gray or dark gray. So it was kind of a combination of a color that's slightly outside of my comfort zone, plus the fact that the fit was also slightly outside of my comfort zone. I usually like something a little bit more oversized. So the way I explain this is I could have dealt with one of those things, but not both of them in a garment, so I just never reached for it. So I ended up frogging it, and I used it had been in the Sandnes Garn Sunday in the color matcha, but held double to make kind of a heavy DK weight vest. And so I frogged that, which was quite a process. I ended up frogging the thing. I just like cut off all of the Italian bind-offs, all the tubular bind-offs with scissors, which is really the way to go. Every single time I have to frog a Italian bind-off, I always think, oh, I'll be patient. I'll really take my time and unpick the whole thing. And then I get like 5 stitches in and just absolutely not. So quite a process, but I am so glad that I frogged that garment. I have been wearing this one so much, and I had never worn the other one. So it was just a nice way to like not get a free project, because we discussed there's mohair held with this, but to be a little bit resourceful. So the reason for the mohair is that in that initial vest, I said I wasn't like totally happy with the color. So the matcha color, it's bright green, but it does lean a little to the yellow side. And this pea shoots color in the mohair is very similar. Like if you've seen them online, they almost look like dupes for each other. But it in person leans a little bit more blue. So actually the two held together, there's some very light marling going on, but nothing that you'd be able to see from a distance. And what they actually end up doing is neutralizing each other quite a bit. I ended up knitting a size 3. This pattern does have a lot of built-in positive ease. I think it's like 25 to 30 centimeters of positive ease, which I love. That is my preference. So I went with a size 3. I did it on 4mm needles, and I used every single inch of the mohair that I had. And actually, in the end, the sort of split hem design, it was supposed to be, I think, like 7 or 8 centimeters longer than what I have. And in my eyes, what I have is like perfect. I would not want it to be any longer than this. So I'm glad that I had that sort of limitation of the amount of mohair. I had exactly 5 balls of the mohair. And in terms of modifications, major modification, or not major, but an important one, was the neckline. So somebody had warned me that the neckline on this pattern was very big, and it did have quite a big stitch count. So what I ended up doing was going down an extra size for the needles. So I was doing the body on 4mm needles, so I think that means I did the neckline on 3mm needles. And that has made it good in terms of the ribbing. I have noticed it stretching out a bit though. It's that construction type where you cast on for the collar, knit the collar, and then knit the collar together with the cast on edge and continue straight into the body. So there's no like going back later to pick up stitches. And that's not my preference because it does tend to stretch out. It doesn't have as much structure. But I did go with it because you can see that the raglan increases, they go seamlessly into the collar, and I think it looks really nice. And it would have been tricky to like go back and pick up stitches in a way that this ribbing was like seamless. So glad I did it, but I do think at some point I'm going to go back in and reinforce the collar. I know that there's a trick you can do with a crochet hook to reinforce it with a bit of yarn. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. Other modifications, I don't think that the pattern has you go down a needle size for the cuffs, but I did, and I'm quite happy with that. It's not cinching in too much or anything. They're still quite wide. I didn't for the hem though, the split hem, because I definitely wouldn't want that cinching in terms of like the design of it. So yeah, nice easy pattern. The only other thing that's kind of notable about this is the needles that I used. So I realized recently when I was working on some of these other projects, actually when I was working on this vest, which we'll talk about soon, it's fingering weight. And because of that, I was using for a lot of it my like sock needles, my Chowgu red lace needles. I'll just grab them. So these are the Chowgu red lace needles. I think these ones are like 80 centimeters. But I have used these for socks for a long time now, just using magic loop. And I really have enjoyed them for that. And I started like wishing that I could use them for other projects as well. And I noticed that when I was working on this fingering weight vest, which again, we'll talk about soon. But I was able to use these needles for that because it was such a small gauge. And then I started thinking, could I use them for other garments? So I decided to try it out for this because the other thing I realized is that almost all of my garment knitting is on like 4 or 4.5 millimeter needles. And I've always felt this way when looking at like sets of interchangeable needles. Chowgu is a little bit different, but so many of the brands, you go and buy a set of interchangeable needles and it's everything from like 3 millimeter needles up to like 12. And for me, it is so rare that I go any higher than like 4.5, maybe 5 millimeter needles. Like incredibly rare. So it, depending on who you are as a knitter, I've always felt that the interchangeable needles are like not always worth it. Again, depending on what's in the set and what type of knitting you gravitate to. So when I was thinking about these needles and how I was gravitating towards them, I didn't want to go out and buy like a whole set of the interchangeable Chowgus. So I just went and bought the same fixed red lace ones in like 4 and 4.5 millimeters. So I got some of these longer ones, and then I also got some of the shorter like 16-inch ones. Is that right? 12 or 16 inch. So between that, I can do like collars and bodies of garments, and it's mostly all I need. And I think that like it's technically not as cost effective as getting a set of interchangeables, because like the interchangeables usually come with like 4 different lengths of cord and like maybe a couple different lengths of tips. But again, you don't end up using all of them. So it really depends on the person. Anyway, what I've realized is that I'm really enjoying using the non-interchangeables. The way I would describe this is that it's sort of like when one of your devices is older, like you've got a phone that's a good 5-6 years old, and you're like, it's fine, it totally still works. And then eventually you upgrade and get like the new device, and you're like, oh, that's what I've been missing out on. And that's kind of what my experience has been like with these needles, where if I use the interchangeables, I'm like, oh, it's not a big deal. They don't come loose all that often. It's not too much of a pain. There's not too much of a join. But then as soon as I use the fixed ones, I'm like, oh, it is nice to not have to worry about that. So I think I've been learning something about my preferences for different needles recently. I never thought that I would be a metal needle person. Someone left me a comment on a video a while ago saying like, the Chow-goos are just different. They just feel different. And they do. It's like, it's a much lighter metal, so it doesn't have quite that like feeling of like cutlery going together or something. It's just not as like harsh. So yeah, I know it's not like a hot take to say that the Chow-goos are great, but the Chow-goos are great. Okay, let's talk about that fingering weight vest now. I won't go too much into the whole process of this because the last video on this channel is all about my self-drafting process using this vest as an example. So if you want to like get really into the weeds about how the self-drafting happened and like the construction and everything, I'll send you to that video. But here we'll just talk about like the bigger picture. This is a self-drafted vest, like I said, fingering weight yarn. It was done in Sandnes Garn Tynn Gynt in, I don't know the color, but very, very dark gray, almost black. So my initial plan was to do this as a DK weight vest and to hold it with Mohair, but I didn't like the swatch very much. So I re-swatched using just the fingering weight yarn and liked it a lot more, unfortunately, because that meant a whole lot more work for me. Thrilled with the result though, especially finishing this like into the summer. I've been able to like wear this outside still as like sort of a cover-up piece, just because it is so like lightweight. So the construction for this is a European shoulder construction. I've got a pretty thin, simple cable design going down the entire thing. And then there's also some cables sort of framing the shoulders and also framing the front along here. Then under the arms, I've got a broken rib there. Yeah, I played around with a few options for that. I didn't want to do just like typical moss stitch or anything. I don't know if this is my absolute favorite, but I think it looks pretty good. And yeah, then the final decision, which was really quite a decision, was the double knit button band. So this garment, like the body of it, was done on, I think, 3.25 millimeter needles. And I think I did the button band on 2 millimeter needles. Is that right? I think so. Before I started this garment, sort of beginning of this year, I got into this really nice flow where all of my sort of bigger garment projects were taking me like exactly a month. So I had like the sweater that I knit in January, the sweater that I knit in February, and then this is the one that I cast on at the beginning of April. And I finished it like last week. So it was all going well until I got to that double knit button band, and oh, that was mentally a challenge to get through. So worth it. It looks fantastic in the end. I was really nervous about it because I feel like anytime you see someone do a double knit button band from a pattern, like at least half the time you watch these podcasts and they're saying that it was so much work and it ended up being like off gauge, like it's kind of drooping or it's like cinching the sweater in and they have to redo the whole thing. So I was so nervous that that would happen to me with this fingering weight one. But I do think it worked out, and I almost wonder if it worked out because I was self-drafting. What I ended up doing for it was doing like a teeny tiny little swatch of double knitting on the 2 millimeter needles. And that way I was able to calculate the row gauge of that double knitting and use that to figure out how many stitches I should pick up for that button band. And I think that extra step of like figuring out the row gauge and doing the math really saved me here, because I can totally imagine how if you were doing this from a pattern, it would tell you how many stitches to pick up, but it's assuming that you're on row gauge for both the double knitting and the body of the sweater itself. So I almost wonder if the process I did here is something that I should do for like any double knit button band and not just a self-drafted one. So yeah, quite a process, but very happy with the result. Very proud to have made this in my head and to now have it out there. And I hope that you guys find the video I made to be helpful. If you ever think about self-drafting something in the future, my hope is that that video can kind of like make the process feel less intimidating and like demystify it a little bit, because I really don't think it needs to be like a scary thing. And I also don't think you need that much experience or like even confidence to go into it. I think just go into it expecting that you're going to make mistakes, that some trial and error is needed, and like, what's the worst that can happen? You end up with a vest that doesn't fit. So I really recommend self-drafting as a way to like slow down and really think about what you're doing and learn some things as you're going. Oh, and the buttons are vintage and I stole them from my mom. Okay, shall we talk socks? I think we need to talk socks. So these are technically my first colourwork socks. We'll talk about it. So in my last episode, I had just finished my pressed flowers shawl, and I talked about how I messed up the chart for it and how this is kind of like a redemption project because I wanted to like prove that I could do the chart properly. So this is the Pressed Flowers sock by Amy Christoffers. I knit this in West Yorkshire Spinners Signature 4-ply in the color Licorice is the black and Dusty Miller is the gray. The gray is like a very light blue gray. And I've been calling these my dead flower socks affectionately because the idea of doing black and gray for a flowery summer sock is hilarious to me, even if it's hilarious to no one else. And yeah, the other kind of funny thing about this as a project, there's a lot of like juxtaposition or irony here because the other thing is it's a flowery sock, and this isn't down to my choices, this is just the pattern itself. Because it's mosaic knitting, you end up doing like 2 rows for every row of knitting that's visible, if that makes sense. So it's very, very thick. It's a very thick sock. So you kind of look at the design and think, oh, cute and summery. But it's not a summery sock because it is so thick. This would be such a nice, like, in boots in winter kind of sock. And it did get me thinking about, like, other mosaic knitting designs that you could do other than the flowers. I think that the most popular project for this on Ravelry is by, I think, Stitches and Stem, and she did little ghosts, which seems very smart, very cute. So I'm thinking more about what you could do with mosaic knitting. It's also an afterthought heel, which was my first time doing that, and I have very mixed feelings about it. I know that people have very strong opinions about, like, I love sock knitters because sock knitters have so many strong opinions about like needle types and heel constructions. So I 100% welcome your thoughts in the comments. Afterthought heel. I was surprised that I really like the fit of it. I think it fits my foot very well. However, I have 2 issues with it. First issue is that, actually, I think I technically solved this one. So which one of these did I do first? This guy. So yeah, by default, at least following the instructions in this pattern, there is like a little hole from where the stitches were picked up. So there's a little hole, and at first I thought, okay, well, I'll just fix that when I go to weave in the ends, but there was only an end to weave in on one side, so I would have had to like take more waste yarn and do the other side, and I didn't care enough to do that. So that's kind of the default. On the second one, I did solve that problem by picking up an extra stitch and then decreasing it on the next round, so not a big deal. The bigger deal is that the process of picking up those stitches was just not fun. I really, really don't enjoy it. I've done it a few times in the past for mittens to do an afterthought thumb, and I just know I don't like the process. It was even worse because this one was black yarn, but that part wasn't fun. The process of actually doing this type of heel, though, was very fun. So not picking up the stitches, but yes, once they were picked up. So again, very mixed feelings about it. But the fact that I like the fit has got me thinking about maybe trying short row heels or maybe even some other types, because so far I've only ever done, before this, I've only ever done heel flap and gussets, both cuff down and toe up. And those are also fine. And I just kind of assumed that I didn't like do that forever because again, it's fine. Sort of similar to the needles, right? Like interchangeable needles are not an issue. They are fine, but maybe there is something more enjoyable out there, if that makes sense. So I do want to start trying different heel constructions is the long story short there. But yeah, I was excited to try that out, and I'm excited to wear these probably in the fall. And we are going to move on to works in progress now, but this is one of those like half works in progress because I finished one sock. Yeah, if you haven't considered it before, highly recommend sock knitting for summer. I have sort of scrapped my summer knitting plans. I had only planned to do like maybe one summer garment, and I just ended up deciding against it. And what's been really nice this summer weather has been socks, because super portable. So if I'm like going places, traveling, very, very portable. It's also not like having an entire wool sweater in your lap. Like you're still getting to work with wool rather than cotton, but there's not so much of it that it's like heating you up. So yeah, my next sock project is the Omnia sock by Charlotte Stone. Now this is one of Charlotte Stone's very early designs. I think like before 2020 or something. And actually the reason that I found this is she came up on my YouTube, and when I saw one of her videos come up on YouTube, I was like, oh, I didn't know that she made videos. And it turns out that she's just getting into making long form videos. So I'll link to her channel because that made me really excited because I'm not really like a short form video consumer. So if you feel the same way, very excited to have some more sock knitting content out there. So yeah, when I was watching her video, I just went through Ravelry, and I've done this before with her patterns where I'm going through Ravelry and I'm trying to find one of her patterns that I can actually knit with the colors that I have, because all of her patterns are so cute. But like, if you take, for example, like the swan one is very cute, but I'm not going to go out and buy orange sock yarn just to do like the beak of a swan. And I've always just thought, well, I'll just wait until I've been knitting for longer, like another year or two, and then I will have like collected an odd assortment of ends and colors. But for now, as you can tell, my color selection is quite limited. So anyway, I basically took out all of my sort of scrap yarn, scrap sock yarn, and I had it next to Ravelry and was scrolling until I found one that worked with the colors that I had. So this is actually my first stranded colorwork sock. And it's really interesting. What caught my eye about it was the fact that it is both ribbed and has the stranded colorwork. The other thing you might notice about this is you might recognize the colors. So these were both leftover yarns. The beige color is Filcolana Arwetta in the color Marzipan, which was left over from my Omnia Socks. And the green, I don't know the color name, but it was Jawoll, which was left over from my Petal Drop socks. So both leftovers, and it was like the perfect amount to do cuff, heel, toe in one color and body in the other. So I did make one modification to these. This was not the cuff in the pattern. When I saw the nice ribbing that goes all the way down the sock, my first thought was, oh, how nice would that be if the ribbing continued up to the cuff? So I'll maybe leave some instructions on my Ravelry project in case anybody wants to match that. But I'm very happy that I was able to get it so that the ribbing, sort of similar to this sweater, right? Like it just continues up seamlessly. So I was really happy with that. It did mean that I ended up using like 3 different needle sizes. So it was 2mm needles up here, then 2.75 for the leg of the sock. I did initially try 2.5. It technically worked, but it was a tight fit to get over my foot. So I frogged it and tried again. So 2 millimeters, 2.75, and then down here is 2.25. There are 6 sizes for this sock. Technically there's only 2 stitch counts, but then there's a really nice table that tells you for those 2 stitch counts, 3 different needle sizes that you could use and like how that affects the gauge and the sizing. So I felt like I had really all the information I needed to do this, even though, again, this is my first stranded colorwork sock. And the other thing that I found interesting is, so this is the one that I'm still working on. And one of the things that she was saying in the videos that I found was that you really don't need to catch your floats. And I was skeptical of that, but I trusted, I went with it. And it does seem to be true. I, though, have been doing the knitting inside out method, as you can see here. That's been working really, really well for me, especially with magic loop, in order to get some relatively even tension on these floats. So it did take maybe like a row or 2 to get used to this technique, but what I end up doing with it is, obviously the sock itself is inside out, and basically what it means is I'm knitting the stitches on the back needle, so like the needle that's closer to you right now rather than the one that's closer to me. So the only kind of irritating thing about it is that I do have this side of the knitting kind of like in my way, and I don't have quite as much visibility, but other than that, super easy, wasn't that hard to get used to. So I'm loving that method for the floats. And I think the floats look okay. If I'm being totally honest, you know, this isn't my first time doing color work, by the way, just color work socks. But whenever knitters get really excited to like show off floats and stuff, I'm never totally sure what they are looking at or what they are so impressed by. Like I've never looked at anyone's floats and thought, ooh, that's ugly. And maybe unless they like haven't woven in their ends or something. But yeah, those are my floats. And then if I flip it inside out, that is what I'm looking like. So I do think that I did the leg, I think I took one chart repeat out of the leg for the first one that I did. I do tend to like shorter socks. Normally I'd probably stop around here actually, but I did want to do a little bit more, and like basically I wanted to use up this scrap yarn. So yeah, really enjoying this. Oh, and while we're here, we have to discuss my project bag. So this will be a very quick sewing segment. I'll put a timestamp on the screen so that you can skip if you're not into sewing. But this is a pattern test I've been part of. I've actually never done a pattern test for sewing or knitting before. So this has been really exciting. And this is the Candy Bag, which is a pattern by Deborah from Unraveled Studios. And it's actually her first ever pattern. And it's been so impressive, and it's been just a really nice experience to be a part of the test group for it. And as you might be able to see, I did make 2 of them. It is patchwork, as you can see here, but you don't need to do the patchwork. That's just an option. And then it's got a really neat drawstring type option, which I have been loving because I can just hang this on my pegboard back here. And it also has a nice amount of structure to it. So what I've been doing, which is, I think, very cute, is basically just having like a nice basket hanging open there. So yeah, so many options for the color blocking on this. And actually, for both of the versions I didn't buy any fabric, I just used scraps. And for the lining inside, it looks like the kind of thing that the structure would involve a lot of interfacing, but actually what she recommends for the lining is denim. So I took one old pair of jeans that doesn't fit anymore, cut it up, and got enough lining for this one and that one. So again, very scrappy, very thrifty, and I've been thrilled with this. I could definitely see myself making more, especially as like I collect more fabric scraps in the future. Last thing about this pattern, which I absolutely love, is if you look inside, it's got this really neat pocket setup where the pockets are elasticated. So this is the snack size version, which as you can see is really just perfect for a sock project, and then sticking some needles or like scrap yarn in the sides there. And then the one that you'll see pretty soon is the sort of larger size. So yeah, I'm not sure when that pattern is coming out, but I think that the testing period finishes around the time that I'm posting this video, so it should be pretty soon. I will link to Deborah's YouTube down below. She does do both knitting and sewing content, so definitely go follow her if you don't already. I just feel like if you like the vibe here, you will like the vibe there, hopefully. So yeah, Omnia Socks. Like I said, I think I am entering a sock knitting phase, so expect to see more socks from me. Okay, let's do this one next. So, as I have been saying, I have been feeling scrappy lately, and I've been wanting to use leftovers, and I think what's been kind of nice about being so scrappy is there's a certain amount of like decision paralysis that comes with going out and purchasing yarn for a project. Like finding a pattern that you really want to make and then trying to find like the perfect yarn and the perfect colorway for it. Like there's quite a bit of like thinking and decision paralysis that goes into that, which sometimes I love. But what I've really been enjoying lately is like just working from, I'll say my stash, but honestly, I don't have much of a stash. It's mostly just like I buy for what I'm currently working on, and then I end up having some leftovers. And what's been really nice about using the leftovers lately is that, you know how they say that like constraint breeds creativity? Is that the saying? I really hope it is. That's how I felt with this, where the stash is like fairly limited, so I have to get kind of creative about what patterns would work for it. Anyway, I feel like I've said this several times on this channel, but I was watching Sasha from Andolini Knits, and she showed this pattern, and I cast this on, I think, that day. So this is the Isla Shawl, which is a pattern by Bichet Bouche. And they recommend their yarn, the Le Petit Lamb's Wool. I used my scraps of Knitting for Olive Merino for this, so light fingering weight yarn, and you might recognize some of these colors. The light brown is cardamom, which is left over from my Curti sweater. The light blue is soft blue, which is also left over from my Curti. And the dark brown is Brown Bear, which is left over from a balaclava that I made for my little niece. So yeah, 3 colors, but this is mosaic knitting, just like the pressed flowers we were looking at. And honestly, at first when I cast this on, I was like, am I getting myself into something that's going to take a long time? Because I wanted to use up all of the yarn. I wanted to make it fairly big, and it is fingering weight. So I was like, am I getting myself into like a really long fingering weight pattern? But actually I did all of this in maybe 2 days. And I'm now at the point where I think I'm going to start the border. I say I think because this is not the size that the pattern actually recommends. The pattern is for, I actually wouldn't call it a shawl, or is it a shawl? They might call it a scarf. It might be the Isla scarf, but honestly, to me, it looks more like a bandana. It is quite small. I think it has 3 or 4 of these chart repeats. I think 4. So it would have stopped around here and then gone into a border. And I think with the border, this would have been like the full size. So I knew I wanted to make it bigger than that. So because I was working with scraps, I kept measuring how much yarn I had left after every like chart repeat. And I've left pretty good notes about that on Ravelry, so if anybody else wants to use this as a scrap project, hopefully you can reference that to get an idea of like how many chart repeats you could get out of your yarn before starting the border. So I was just sure to keep an eye on that, did as many of these as I could, and then I kind of paused because I'm going to start the border. I think I just haven't decided which colors I want to use for the border. You can see how much I have left here. So not much of the blue, but I don't think I need much more of the blue. Quite a bit of the light brown. So that's what the pattern recommends using for the border, but I might go a little bit rogue with that. I haven't decided yet. But yeah, this just flew by. It's a very loose gauge. I don't know if you can see how like drapey and like almost see-through it is. So fingering weight yarn, and I am using 3.5 millimeter needles. So just incredibly enjoyable. I would highly recommend for using scraps. Again, you have to be kind of cognizant of the yarn quantities because you can see that it's that construction type that starts with just a few cast-on stitches and then pretty quickly increases. So the rows use more yarn as you go along. So you do have to be a little bit careful of the quantity of yarn that you're using for each row. But as long as you're okay with that and like you have a scale to measure things. The only thing I got a little bit confused about with the pattern was it doesn't really give you instructions about how to carry the yarn up along the sides, which supposedly you have to do because if you were like cutting the yarn, that would be a lot of ends to weave in. So it took me a while to like play around with that and do it in a way that the tension isn't too tight, that this is the side where I'm carrying yarn up. Because if the tension was too tight, then that would kind of cinch in. So I think I've got it in a way that it looks good now. Like you can see, for example, the color that ends up getting carried up the furthest there is the light blue. So that is like a good inch and a half that float basically has to get carried. But yeah, I'm very happy with my Isla Shawl. I'll probably be finishing this quite soon. I do just need to decide what to do about the border. It would also, I think, be a very good project if you want to try color work, but you're a little bit intimidated by it because, like I said with the pressed flowers, mosaic knitting is like, it's basically like a cheat code for color work. It's so much easier. Summer podcasts are so funny because it's such a like cliche of knitting podcasts that you're here with like a cup of tea and something cozy. And summer, I've got sparkling water. Hopefully that's not in frame. I don't need to be advertising for Farm Boy. Okay. And now you can see my larger of the two bags. This has a vest quantity of yarn in it right now, just for reference on the size, and I would say it's quite full. So the story with this one is I finished my Zakuri cardigan a couple of months ago, and that was my first time using Durarum Natura Gilead as yarn, and I enjoyed that yarn so much as like a process knit that I immediately started thinking about what else I could use it for, and my thoughts were cables, that it would make lovely like sort of plush cables, and also a vest because it's very like, it feels very lightweight. It's a worsted weight yarn, but it feels very like airy. I think because of how it's spun. I'm no expert in how yarn is spun, but it's spun a lot more like loosely. So yeah, I will say I do like to comment on like how yarn is wearing over time. The Zakuri that I finished a couple months ago, pilling a tiny bit, but not enough to like concern me. Also, when yarn is very soft and pills, I'm still okay with using it in a vest because for a vest, there isn't like that friction of arm against body like this. So I'm still totally confident with this, which is the Moby Slipover by Petite Knit. So usually I would say that my process is what we talked about earlier, where I find a pattern, I really want to make it, so I find like the perfect yarn, the perfect color for it. This was a rare opportunity where I was doing the opposite. I really wanted to use this yarn again. I wanted a vest in it, so I went and found a vest pattern. And I actually realized that this is my first time doing a petite knit pattern in like over a year or so. And I was interested to see how I would feel about that because I haven't done one of her patterns since I was more of like a beginner. And I don't really have any like hot takes about petite knit. If you're here for hot takes, I feel like you're in the wrong place. But this has just been fine as a pattern. I actually think it would be a pretty good like beginner cable pattern because what I didn't realize until I started is that the lattice cables in the middle are not supposed to be real cables. They're sort of a mock cable in the instructions, which I am not doing. I have kind of a vendetta against mock cables. Maybe that's the hot take. When I have done mock cables in the past, I find that this might just be my knitting. I find that they do not look as good as real cables and that they are not easier or not easier enough for it to be worth it. So I saw that and just said, I'm doing real cables. They're 1x1 cables. If you know how to cable without a cable needle, it's fine. So I'm doing real cables in the middle. Only other modification is that I'm off gauge. I actually think this was a mistake because the Moby sweater is worsted weight, and for some reason I just assumed that the slipover would be as well. But it's not. It's supposed to be DK weight, and I think a fairly light DK weight. So I am quite off gauge. And this is the back panel, by the way. I actually haven't decided yet what size I'm going to do. I cast it on for the smallest size. And I'm at the point now where the instructions have been exactly the same for the first 3 sizes. So the back panel up to this point is this for the first 3 sizes, so I could still decide between the first 3 sizes. So I think that my plan is that probably right after I'm done talking to you, I'm going to wet block this, and that way I can kind of see what it's looking like and whether my gauge is still working out and everything, and then I can make the decision about the size. I feel like I'm erring on the side of doing one of the bigger of those 3 sizes, which might not be a popular opinion, but I do have quite a few hand knit vests at this point, and they're all about the same size. They're all in the range of probably like 15 to 20 centimeters positive ease, and I feel like it would be nice to just have like some variety and have one like really big vest. It also might be nice to have it be bigger for layering purposes, like if I wanted to have like a button up underneath it or something. So again, still deciding the size. So yeah, excited to see how this keeps coming together. And actually, the other thing I'll note is that this is also a fairly memorizable chart. Maybe not if it's like your first cables ever, but otherwise pretty memorizable. It's been not like mindless, but close to it. So very nice process-wise. Oh, one last thing I'll tell you about this. I did some math that I think you'll find fun. So I did all of this in like 2 days. Yeah, 2 days, maybe a day and a half. It has been so quick. So this is a worsted weight project for me. And of course, this is the second gray vest that you have seen in this video. So the first gray vest that you saw in this episode was this one, which again is fingering weight. It took me about 2 months, 2.5 months. And then I go, of course, into this, which is an entire back panel in 2 days. So I was like, am I just flying through this? So I did a little bit of math to compare these 2 gauges. So fingering weight versus worsted weight. This one has about 600 stitches in a 10 by 10 swatch. This one has 1,400. So This is at least twice the amount of knitting that this one is, and that doesn't even include the fact that this has a double knit button band. So I think in my head I had never quite realized how significant the difference would be between fingering to worsted weight, but obviously it is very significant. I think that is everything that I have for you today. Thank you for being here.